All right, good afternoon and welcome to our October information session, From Research to Reality, Translating Reliability and Validity Findings into Actionable Insights. My name is Haley Von Holst, and I am the information session lead for the CMS Measures Management System contract supported by Battelle. Before we get started on the presentation, I'll cover a few quick items. If you'd like to download today's slides, they'll be available on the CMS MMS Hub after the presentation. We'll also post a recording of today's session on the MMS Hub in a few weeks. All right, we can jump to the next slide. So as part of the Measures Management Systems outreach task, CMS produces these information sessions throughout the year to educate about quality measurement topics and engage those interested in measure development and maintenance. I highly encourage you to submit questions throughout today's presentation using the Q&A feature near the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So we'll conclude with that question and answer segment after our discussion. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters today. We have Jeff Geppert and Matt Pickering talking about our topic. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Haley. And hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. Next slide. So as Haley mentioned, my name is Jeff Geppert. I support the measurement science team for endorsement and maintenance, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Pickering, who oversees the endorsement and maintenance process. So at the end of the presentation or during the presentation, we invite everyone to enter into the QA what questions or challenges you may have had in your own experience with these reliability and validity concepts, and to make suggestions for topics that might be of interest for future presentations or guidance materials. Next slide. So our overall theme for today is really that explicit evidence is actionable evidence. Now we're going to be talking about how to make the evidence for reliability and validity more explicit and therefore more trustworthy. So ultimately what we want are measures that are actionable, impactful, appropriately burdensome, and strategic. So in measure reviews, we often consider evidence put forth by measure stewards and developers in support of claims about various measure properties, including entity-level reliability and validity. However, the meaning of the empirical data and statistical results and what actionable insights those results should suggest is often somewhat uncertain. So today we're going to talk about how we understand the meaning of this evidence. And in particular, we're going to talk about what the evidence suggests in terms of the choices available to persons, which we include as patients and beneficiaries, plan members, and entities, including clinicians and facilities and plans and other providers. So we're going to start by considering the relationship between reliability and validity and what it tells us about these concepts, and then consider reliability and validity separately. Next slide. Okay, so we're first going to consider the relationship between reliability and validity. Next slide. So we think that a key to understanding the concepts of reliability is really related to this concept of choice making or decision making. So by choice making, we mean what choices are available to persons and entities and what resources are available or not available to support those choices. So choice making is really the agent that drives change, drives transformation. And so the ultimate purpose of validity evidence and sort of as a derivative reliability evidence is to establish a causal association between the person or entity response to the quality program, which includes the quality measure, and the measure focus. So at the person level, the person should respond to the quality program and the quality measure, typically through selection of a better performing entity over a worse performing entity. And then the worst performing entity should respond to the quality program, quality measure through choice to allocate resources to transform to a better performing entity. So what we're trying to substantiate with validity and reliability evidence is what we call our should causal claim. For validity, that there are known and effective ways of selection and choice that the person or entity should use. And then the reliability is that most of the variation in the measure focus is attributable to the variation in those known and effective ways, and that other explanations, including things like chance, are ruled out. Next slide. So another sort of key to understanding the concepts of reliability and validity is consider the nature of the mitigation that is necessary to address any deficiency in reliability or validity. And that's often sort of the best way to determine the difference between reliability and validity, which, as we'll talk about, are really sort of two ends of on a continuum. So to illustrate this, we consider sort of two common metaphors of reliability and validity. The first is the target metaphor, which comes from the book by Daniel Kahneman on his book on noise. And then the question is, what can we learn about the concepts of reliability and validity sort of from this metaphor? So in the metaphor, we have four teams. Team A is both reliable and valid. The marks are all sort of close together and hit the target. Team B is reliable. The marks are close together, but not valid. Team C is not reliable. The marks are kind of scattered, but they sort of centrally kind of located around the target. And then Team D is neither reliable nor valid. So to think about what each of the teams needs to do in order to improve their performance, Team A obviously needs to do nothing. Team B needs to adjust its site, needs to account for any sort of environmental factors. Team C needs to build muscle memory. It needs to standardize its movements. And Team D basically needs to do all the above. So what does this tell us about the concepts of validity and reliability? So for validity, that it's very closely related to structure, these known and effective ways to increase the likelihood of the measure of focus. We're implementing both sites. We're implementing technologies, resources that allow us to sort of point us in the right direction. With reliability, it tells us that it's related to sort of the standardization of process, trying to make things replicable, building the muscle memory. So very much related to standardization of process, which ultimately, if it becomes standardized and adopted as structure, becomes sort of a part of validity. Next slide. The second metaphor is the Moneyball metaphor, used by sort of Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, who said that he preferred to draft college players because there were more observations to consider. So this is sort of more closely aligned to what we think of about in terms of reliability in the quality measurement space. Basically, that when we have more observations to consider, the measures are more reliable. But it's a little bit different in this case. So player A, the way to sort of think about this is we've seen an entire sort of season of performance, right? A lot of data elements to observe. And also they perform in college. They perform at a very high level that's very similar to what we'll be expecting of them, in the major leagues. Player B, we've seen a whole season of their performance. However, they're in high school, and so it's less valid. We're not seeing them perform in the context in which we will expect them to perform. Player C, we've seen very little of their performance, even though they're playing in a rigorous environment. And then player D is sort of both. We're seeing little of their performance, and it's not in the sort of the appropriate context. So what does this tell us about sort of the reliability and validity from this metaphor? So first, with respect to validity, so validity is really about ability and not effort. It's not about sort of trying harder. If the response to low measure performance is try harder, that's not really a validity argument. We have to be talking about ability, which are those capabilities that translate sort of across settings, across contexts. So apply from different types of stadiums and different kind of weather, different kinds of pitching quality. So in reliability, what it tells us about that is this is more typically how we think about reliability again in quality measurement. However, note that there's sort of two features of reliability. One is that reliability is both positive and negative. So it's not just negative, it's both. So you could face a more challenging pitcher, whereas over the course of this, early in the season, whereas over the course of the season, you'd see a more representative sort of selection of pitchers. That would be a negative. However, it's also possible that early in the season, you would face a less competitive pitcher. And so that would be sort of in your favor. So we need to think of reliability as both positive and negative. The second aspect of reliability that this teaches us about is that reliability is both sort of cross-sectional and time series. So in this time period, you might have had a negative sort of experience, a more competitive pitching, but over time, you might have seen a more balanced sort of panel of pitchers. And so over time, reliability sort of, might kind of more even out. But we don't typically, in quality measurement, consider evaluating reliability sort of from this time series perspective. We take more of the, what's called sort of the Sisyphus approach to measurement, where we sort of roll this big heavy rock up the hill every year, and then every year we let it sort of roll down again, and we sort of start from scratch every year. So and an opportunity for sort of improvement in the way we engage with measure development is to think more about evaluating reliability in a cumulative sort of fashion. Next slide. So the final sort of comment here before we sort of focus on reliability is to guard against sort of equating reliability too closely with the concept of randomness. So as we've seen in our metaphors, reliability also has to do with standardizing our processes, ensuring better performance in extreme and in varied cases. So we tend to use randomness and sort of in a very kind of informal sense of sort of not able to be predicted. But ultimately, there is always sort of a cause. It might be a cause that is difficult to observe. It might be a very complex cause, but there is ultimately sort of a cause. And so we want to be able to sort of understand and evaluate sort of what those causes are. So just as practices such as risk adjustment and exclusions sometimes can obscure our understanding about how a measure works, so reliability adjustment can also prevent us from considering important differences across persons and entities that should be thoughtfully considered and not simply dismissed as noise. So again, the question to ask is always, in reality, what is it that's driving performance and influencing our choices? So with that, I'll turn it over to the next slide and turn it over to my colleague, Matt Pickering, to discuss reliability.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to some. Thanks for joining today. So that was a great intro to these concepts. As Jeff mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about reliability here before going into validity. So let's go to the next slide and think about, like, what do we mean about reliability? What is reliability? And really, reliability and validity themselves, while they're distinct concepts and measurements, they really can be viewed as existing on a spectrum that assesses overall quality or usefulness of a measure. As you can see those arrows represented below. So understanding how these two interact and complement each other is really crucial for developing effective measures especially measures within healthcare quality measurement. So validity, as we see up here in the quotes, is measuring the right thing, whereas reliability is measuring the thing right. And validity refers here to the accuracy of the measure, whether it's measuring what it's supposed to measure, right? Validity is about that truthfulness and appropriateness of conclusions that can be drawn about the measure. But reliability then refers to the consistency or the repeatability of that measure. It's about that precision and stability of measurements. So being able to consistently produce the same result. So there are two types of error, though, on this spectrum to really take into consideration that can impact these concepts. One is systemic distortion, where you can see on the validity side. So this error really refers to some of the biases that are consistently present in the measurement system and really can affect the validity of the measure. So these can really stem from the way the measure is designed or how the data are collected and processed, for example. But then on the flip side, with reliability, the error here is that non-systematic waste futility, and this really refers to what, as Jeff was mentioning, some of this randomness or errors that do not consistently affect the measurements, but they do represent inefficiencies or irrelevancies in the measurement process. So these are typically things like noise in the data, right? Random fluctuations that do not really contribute to any understanding about the measure's focus, and they're not systematically, they do not systematically bias results either. And the type of error affects the reliability of the measure because it introduces variability that's not due to some actual change in what is being measured. So both concepts distinct, but also obviously somewhat connected. And let's go to the next slide, if we could. So again, we're talking about accountable entity reliability here for today's presentation. So it's looking at these reliability at the accountable entity level. And generally, that is calculated using the formula you can see on the screen there, which that formula and these concepts of between and within, and the symbol here before those represents variation, right? This is a fundamental concept in statistics, particularly in the context of assessing consistency of measures across different entities or groups. So the numerator really captures the variance between different entities. So that's what the between is. It's the variance that we see between different entities or groups. And the denominator is the sum of the variance within the groups, so within the entity, within the group, and the variance between those. So it's a sum of that total variance observed in the data, so both the variance between and variance within. So with this equation in mind, then, high reliability metric or high reliability really is indicated that the variance between the different entities is large compared to the variance within the same entity. And this indicates that most of the variability in the data can be attributed to differences between entities rather than random fluctuations or inconsistencies within the same data. So this also suggests the measure can effectively really distinguish between entities in terms of the quality of performance, right? So some of the common methods used to really calculate reliability, especially again at the entity level, that you can see listed on this slide, really are suited for the different types of data and analysis needs. So we see a lot of times the Adams data binomial method used within quality measurement at the accountable entity level. This is really appropriate for sort of binary or proportion types of data. And it's referenced by Adams here from a RAND article in 2009. And it's really suitable for data where outcomes are binary. So yes, no, right? Or success or failure. You also have other types of risk-adjusted measures or measures that are more of ratio types of measures. These are more complex types of measures, and they involve a method that we use is called interclass correlation, or ICC, and along with the Spearman-Brown prophecy formula for adjustment. So this method is ideal for complex data involving ratios when adjustments for risks are really necessary. And then the last one you see on the slide there is hierarchical or borrowing strength, right? So this uses a technique which is like mixed logistic regression and empirical based methods. And the approach really is to increase the reliability by borrowing strength across different entities. And this helps in stabilizing the estimates, especially when data are from entities that are sparse, for example. Let's go to the next slide. So what is good reliability then? So first, let's clarify sort of a common misconception. So reliability is really a feature of the entities being measured, not the measure itself, right? So let that sink in for a second, right? Because reliability is a feature of the entities being measured, not the measure itself. And this means that when we talk about reliability in the context of healthcare, we're really referring to the consistency of an entity's performance, such as a hospital or healthcare provider, rather than the measure. So that's why reliability is really the feature of the entity being measured, not the measure itself. And a key aspect of reliability is its association with the likelihood of misclassification. So misclassification occurs when an entity is incorrectly classified, either as performing worse when they're actually better, or vice versa. This is crucial because such errors can really significantly impact decisions being made on these classifications, such as resource allocation or policy adjustments, for example. Reliability also has important equity implications as well. And if certain populations are more likely to receive care from entities with low reliability, this really can lead to further systemic biases and further disparities in healthcare outcomes. So really, it's essential to recognize and address these disparities to ensure that there's equitable healthcare being delivered. Using the median reliability metric, which sometimes we see in submissions, but sometimes that's produced here, using that median reliability metric really can be misleading, right? It really lacks some meaningfulness and transparency across, meaningfulness and transparency, just because it does not reflect the distribution of reliability across the entities, right? So a high reliability score in some entities does not compensate for any offset or low reliability in others. Each entity's reliability needs to be assessed. So while related, reliability and stability are not identical concepts. So stability really refers to persistence of reliability over time, and the relationship between these two depends on whether the factors driving high reliability are systematic and persistent. And really understanding whether the factors contributing to high reliability are systematic, so they are inherent to the system, and persistent, meaning they're consistent over time, is really crucial when you're thinking about good reliability. This really helps in predicting future performance and making informed decisions about where to focus improvement efforts. So in thinking about what good reliability is, these are really key features to keep in mind. So let's take a look at an example, especially circling back to what I mentioned, like just having the median reliability metric may be misleading. We want to see that there's sort of a distribution of reliability estimates to really give that full picture of where reliability may be low in certain entities or sufficient in others. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a table that showcases a signal to noise reliability estimate across deciles of performance, right? Deciles here of the reliability estimates. So you can see what's in red here are those reliability estimates that are less than 0.6, which is something we deem as acceptable or sufficient. And you can see majority of those, 51% of those entities have reliability less than that. And this could be, obviously this means that most of the variation in the measure of performance is not attributable to the variation in these known and effective ways. Having this distribution, you can now see that there is a good visualization of where the reliability may be lower for this entire aggregate score, where the overall score means, where it says 0.7. So the overall is 0.7, which is higher than the 0.6, but the distribution shows that there are some entities that are lower than that. And so there's something that needs to be considered and addressed here in order to mitigate those low reliability estimates. So going to the next slide, let's talk about some of that mitigation about low reliability and sort of what can we do here. So low reliability does not automatically render the measure useless, right? So again, thinking about that there there may be some need for something that has a low reliability, and we'll kind of touch on that here in a second. But the utility of the measure with low reliability really depends significantly on the available alternatives and the potential consequences of using the measure. And so it's about finding the best tool available for the job, right? And even if it's not perfect. So you want to consider the nature of what's being measured. For the measures focusing on events that should not happen, for example, so like never events in healthcare, the consideration given to reliability might be less. In these cases, or these instances of these never event type of measures, the occurrence of a single event is significant enough to warrant action or to warrant the fact there needs to be some measurement here, regardless of the measure's overall reliability. So that's a critical aspect of using any measure, particularly those with low reliability. It's really reasoning process used to rule out other explanations. Another piece here is efforts to mitigate the harm caused by low reliability must be carefully balanced and with other important considerations. So for instance, increasing the minimum sample size might boost participation, but could also affect the validity of the measure. Similarly, extending the period of performance to gather more data might enhance validity, but could also delay necessary actions based on the measure's findings. You also want to consider harm as well, and the actual harm or impact of using a measure with low reliability depends heavily on some decision contexts, which that can include various features of the quality program, for example. So factors such as certain thresholds or benchmarks, adjustments to low volume, or whether reporting is mandatory or even voluntary, they all play really crucial roles in determining how much the reliability of a measure really affects its overall utility. So thinking about mitigation of low reliability, these are good things to keep in mind to sort of think through to help justify potentially that there is importance to have this measure. And it's not useless, even with some low reliability estimates. So let's take it a step further and go to the next slide. So really to effectively address some of this low reliability in healthcare quality measures, we really first must thoroughly understand the characteristics of those entities, right? And the individuals within both low reliability and high reliability. So you can see, you can spread that out across a table. You can kind of see where, how many instances that's happening, but you're really trying to understand those entities and those person level or patient level features. And this really is helpful to help tailor the mitigation strategies and approaches, right? So low reliability might be acceptable in certain contexts. For example, if measures have a direct and clear causal link with critical outcomes, such as complications or healthcare-associated infections, which are HAI, the importance of detecting these events can outweigh drawbacks of low reliability. In situations where there's no alternatives or no alternative measures that may exist, the low reliability measure may provide valuable insights, right? So if there's nothing else that exists, there may be some value in still having a measure out there. An example of this is the Farmer's Almanac, right? Which, despite its limitations, offers some good guidance in absence of any other particular tools. Lastly, there's sometimes low reliability measure can be supplemented by related measures that have high reliability, whether they're structural process or outcome measures, and this type of combination can really enhance decision making. So choosing to use a measure with low reliability involves careful consideration of potential trade-offs, right? So when you're thinking about harm versus reliability, right? In some cases, the potential harm from not using a measure may be greater than the harm from its low reliability. So using the low reliability measure could be more beneficial than not using any measure. Also keeping in mind the trade-off of reliability versus validity. So there are some scenarios where a highly reliable measure might not be very valid, and vice versa. So in such cases, prioritizing a measure with lower reliability but higher validity might be more advantageous, right? And then opting for a measure with low reliability might sometimes be necessary to maintain higher participation in a quality program, which touched on a little bit earlier. So high participation rates, obviously they can be crucial for the overall success and credibility of that quality improvement program. But ultimately, while really striving for high reliability in all measures is ideal, there are practical considerations in specific contexts where a measure with low reliability might still have some value. And understanding these contexts and really being able to clearly articulate that and weighing those trade-offs can really help provide that value, and being able to communicate that to reviewers or other entities about why this measure, even with low reliability, should exist and have value. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. We're going to get into validity, and I'm sure there'll be some questions. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Matt. So providing evidence to sort of substantiate claims about validity, what we call our should claim, has probably been one of the most challenging tasks for measure evaluations. So let us sort of start with the definition. Next slide. So the definition of validity comes from the work of Samuel Messick, and his definition has been adopted more formally in professional standards and in guidance from FDA on evaluating patient-reported outcomes. So it's worth sort of reading the definition carefully. So validity is an overall evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationale support the adequacy of appropriate interpretations and actions on the basis of the measure. So some of the sort of terms to focus on are the degree. So validity is not an either or, it's a sort of a continuum. Evidence, empirical evidence and theoretical rationale. So we consider both data and logic when we're substantiating validity claims. And then importantly, sort of interpretations and actions. Sort of what are those responses to the measure that we talked about sort of at the beginning. So sometimes this definition of validity is called modern validity theory or response-based validity or argument-based validity. And in argument-based validity, sort of one makes first a claim. So there are known and effective ways that the person or entity should use, that's the claim. And then provides evidence in support of that claim, either empirical or logic. And then makes an argument about why the evidence supports the claim. And oftentimes it's the argument part that is missing, but it's also the argument part that makes the evidence actionable. And so we need to sort of include that argument in order to really sort of make the evidence sort of actionable. So this claim argument structure, which is called an assurance case, which is a sort of National Institute of Standards and Technology standard, is important for assuring sort of trustworthy systems. So next slide. So now that we have our definition, what exactly do we need to demonstrate to establish validity? So first, we have to identify the appropriate actions, interpretations, and actions that persons and entities may take in response to the measure. In other words, what specifically is the mechanism used? So one way of establishing the mechanism is to focus on what is the purpose of the measure. What change is the measure trying to make? And how is the measure intended to work? Ultimately, we want to be able to describe the mechanism, which is typically a complex of mechanisms, which are resources and responses to those resources that increase the likelihood of the measure focus. So for example, consider a measure of appropriate imaging. So the measure works by facilitating some choices and constraining other choices. So the mechanisms include things like advanced clinical decision support systems on existing EHR platforms. They include protocol development, standardized workflows and protocols. They include training and education, conducting training sessions on these new protocols and systems. They include some means and mechanisms of monitoring and feedback, so you can know whether those protocols and practices are being adhered to. They typically require some process for multidisciplinary collaboration, regular meetings amongst different specialists and physicians and other professionals. some means of sort of remote collaboration, and then ultimately, some means of patient engagement, patient-centered educational materials and involving patients. So all of those things are necessary in order to increase the likelihood of the measure focus, which is adoption and implementation of the appropriate imaging protocol. So some of the context that is influential and whether those mechanisms can actually be implemented obviously include the available human resources, the available financial resources, the available technical resources, the available educational resources. All of those things sort of trigger whether those mechanisms can actually be put in place. Next slide. So the green circles on the previous slide represent claims that are often not very well supported in measure submissions, but are really necessary to understand sort of measure actionability. So to ensure that a measure is trustworthy and ultimately will yield a net benefit to both persons and entities, we need to be explicit about all of the evidence and then explicitly evaluate that evidence. So historically, most of the evidence submitted in support of quality measures is really related to importance. So for example, in our image processing example, we have a measure based on an evidence-based guideline. So clearly that guideline is evidence and an argument that the measure focus is associated with something that matters, a material outcome to entities and persons, which is really, focused on importance. However, without evidence and argument that there are known and effective ways of increasing the likelihood of the measure focus, both adopting and implementing that guideline using the mechanisms that we just discussed, so that the validity claim remains unsubstantiated. Next slide. So just like reliability, there's some conceptions about validity that we need to consider. So first is the maxim from Carl Sagan about the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so we see this frequently where evidence of validity is put forth, and maybe it's not compelling or convincing, and then the conclusion that is drawn is that the measure is not valid, but that's not an appropriate conclusion. It is the case that validity may not have been established, but that does not mean that the lack of validity has been established. So the lack of validity also needs to be sort of positively established. And then again, just like reliability, validity is not a universal property of the measure. The question is not, does the measure work, but why does the measure work, for whom and under what circumstances? And this is the framework developed by Paulson and Tilley in their sort of realist evaluation work. They're often, they're not really in the modern validity sort of framework. There are not different types of validity, so concurrent, predictive, or discriminant validity. Rather, there's just one universal type of validity, which is construct, and then different forms of evidence and arguments that support that construct validity. There's obviously also criterion validity, but that relates more to the concept of interest rather than the context of use. Next slide. So the second thing we have to show, in addition to sort of the existence of those interpretations and actions, is that we have to show the adequacy of our interpretations and actions based on empirical and theoretical rationales. In other words, the mechanisms have to be known and they have to be effective, which can be established by data or logic, and ideally both. So to begin with, what needs to be articulated is a theory about why the measure works. And then we use that theory to guide empirical or other investigations. Too often people just put forth empirical investigations without beginning with sort of an underlying theory about why those are the right empirical investigations to be able to demonstrate validity. We use typically a logic model or concept map to be able to articulate what that theory is about the known and effective ways to increase the likelihood of the measure of focus. And we're really encouraging sort of the use of the technical expert panels which in addition to sort of informing measure specs and risk adjustment models, to provide input onto these logic models, to provide buy-in and face validity. And then once we've done that, then we use it, the logic model, to identify what are those claims that really need to be substantiated with evidence and with argument. Next slide. So sometimes we use the term construct validity, which is easier to say than known and effective ways. And so historically, measure developers would provide correlation evidence. And regardless of whether the correlations were high or low, positive or negative, there was typically always some rationale for why the evidence supported validity. So what we're trying to address in that ambiguity by requiring more explicit articulations of what those mechanisms are involved in both measures and arguments about why those mechanisms are sufficient explanations for the association that's being put forth. So the most fundamental sort of evidence put forth to support the validity of measure is this variation in the measure focused across entities. But then the argument needs to be that this variation, the best explanation for this variation is variation in the quality construct, those known and effective ways, and that all other possible explanations for that variation have been ruled out. Similarly, oftentimes measure developers will put forth evidence of variation across known groups as a demonstration of validity. But again, you need to be able to make an argument that demonstrates that that variation in the quality construct is the best explanation for this variation across subpopulations. And then finally, measure developers will submit correlations between two measures. So in our imaging example, they'll take two sort of appropriate imaging measures and they'll correlate them. And if there's a positive correlation of some magnitude, then they'll make an argument about why that they'll make a claim that that supports validity of the measure. But what we really need to do is make an argument about why there's some sort of mechanism associated with the first measure. There's some set of mechanisms associated with the second measure. There's some overlap in those mechanisms. If the overlap is complete, then the correlation ought to be very high. If the correlation is only partial, if the overlap is only partial, then the correlation might be less. That could still provide evidence that supports the claim that it is the mechanism that is responsible for the association, but you sort of need to make that sort of next step. Next slide. Those are all sort of inference to the best explanation type of arguments. The other type of argument that we typically see is that we have an entity level correlation between variation in some aspect of the mechanism and the measure focus. And this is really sort of an induction argument that the correlation holds across various populations, various settings over time, and therefore it makes it more likely that the known and effective way is responsible for that variation in the measure focus. And similarly, we might see a correlation between some aspects of structure in the measure focus. But again, we need to have a complementary argument about what is it about volume that enables the mechanism, makes the mechanism more effective, that really sort of, again, makes that mechanism responsible for that association. So together, sort of this claim, argument, evidence sort of structure, these assurance cases, makes the validity evidence sort of more easier to interpret, and then therefore easier to sort of act upon. Next slide. So developers often also provide literature evidence in support of validity claims. And so another area of emphasis is to sort of provide rigorous assessment of that evidence. Again, the focus is the same. What is the claim made by the literature? What is the evidence in support of that claim? And what is the argument about why the evidence supports the claim? But here the claim comes from the literature. And then in addition, we want to understand sort of the quality of that evidence. So a high level of quality of evidence is an interpretation where further research is unlikely to have a significant impact on our confidence level in that claim. And then low quality would be that further research is highly likely to have a significant impact. And then we consider the confidence level we have in that evidence. And is the body of evidence, is there independence, is there consistency, is there robustness? If all of those things are true, our confidence level is high. Otherwise, it's less high. So what do we sort of do with these assessments in the next slide? So if both the quality level of the evidence is high and our confidence level in the evidence is high, then we consider that claim to be established. So it sort of met the community standards for adding that claim to the body of evidence. But then there are gradations of that: provisionally established, arguably true, speculative, arguably false, provisionally ruled out, and then completely ruled out. And so we take the body of claims, so now we have claims related to importance, validity, and usability. And then if they're either established, provisionally established, or arguably true, then that measure is likely to be endorsable. If they're all speculative or in fact ruled out, provisionally ruled out, or arguably false, then it's highly unlikely that measure is to be endorsable. And then if there's some mixture of that is potentially endorsable, depends upon sort of the discussions that we have with our committees. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about sort of ruling out possible explanations. So this is sort of a table that lists all the possible explanations that could potentially explain why the measured focus varies. And so the things that we tend to focus on in our evidence evaluations are things like confounding, C is a common cause of both variation in the measure of focus and the quality response. So that's sort of our risk adjustment analysis. We consider things like chance, which relates to our sort of randomness, reliability type analysis. But ultimately, what we're trying to show is causation, that the quality program and the response from the entity is the cause of the measure of focus. But we have to consider all of these other things, whether they're plausibly important and is there evidence that they've been ruled out. Next slide. So again, just a final sort of word about risk adjustment. So really, what is the purpose of risk adjustment in this context? Which is to really rule out that the variation in the measure of focus is due to other factors and not due to the response of the quality of the entity to the quality program. So C is a common cause of A and B. So what we're looking for here is really a strong sort of conceptual model that explains why these various factors, all of which could be common causes between A and B, either are important or not important in this particular context. And so the first sort of consideration in our evaluation of the risk adjustment model, in addition to its sort of empirical performance, is that conceptual model about sort of the arguments that are made about whether these factors really matter or do not matter. Next slide. So these are some of the references we've talked about. Paulson and Tilly is sort of a seminal text in evaluation. The Schmidt is a commentary that includes some useful citations that provide some of the sort of the thoughts on the benefits of noise. And I just wanted to mention that we have sort of a companion presentation next week. We're doing a measure development workshop. And we're going to be sort of developing a little bit deeper into some of these sort of evidence considerations around reliability and validity. So Haley, I will stop there.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Jeff and Matt, for that great presentation. We've already had a flurry of questions coming in. So just a reminder that some were answered in a written form. So take a look at the Q&A feature of the meeting to see if your question was answered. Please continue to add questions as you have them. So please use that feature and submit, and we'll try to cover as many in-scope questions as possible. So with that, I'm going to jump into our first question. And I think this question will be for Matt. So how do you address equity concerns in reliability, especially considering that certain populations might be more likely to receive care from low reliability entities? What strategies are in place to ensure that these populations are not disproportionately affected by potential misclassifications? Sorry, we got a few in there for you.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. So the first thing is really that there should be some sort of a evaluation of the distribution of reliability scores across those populations and settings. So again, thinking about how you're really trying to understand those entities and the persons or people that are also attributed to that entity. So looking at the distribution helps you see that variation in those reliability estimates. And when certain populations are more likely to receive care from lower reliability entities, targeted interventions such as training, as well as additional resources or even adjustment approaches like risk adjustments of the measure stratification are what we would recommend to be considered and also potentially implemented. So the training here and additional resources really may require some investigation or discussion with some accountable entities to understand if there's some issues going on with the measure, or how maybe some additional resources can help support their activities to achieve the measure performance, especially across those different populations. So these strategies really can help improve reliability within these entities, but also ensure that there's fair and accurate assessments across the populations. So again, coming back to distribution of those scores across entities, kind of narrowing in on where there might be some challenges, and unpacking that a little bit to determine whether or not maybe there's additional training that needs to happen with those entities, if there's additional resource needs that also need to be considered, but also at the measure level, if there's maybe risk adjustment that also needs to be thought of a little bit differently, or stratification as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. Again, see some more questions coming, so we're going to keep going while we have a few minutes left. This question is for Jeff. For validity claims, how does one ensure that the evidence and arguments used are robust enough to support the claims?
It's a good question, because ultimately it has to be sort of compelling to the people that are impacted. So when we sort of talk about whether a claim has been established or not, the definition of that is that community standards have been met for substantiation of a claim. So implied in that is that communities may differ in terms of the standards that are required in order to be able to substantiate a claim. And so, basically, measures have to be sort of fit for purpose. They have to sort of meet the needs of the community that want to use the measure for whatever purpose they're using it. And so it is very much of a sort of a human in the loop process, right? Where these claims and this evidence and this arguments is put forth, to a community, and then the community sort of evaluates whether it's sufficient or whether there's really important gaps. And so that's really why we have these, this committee structure and these committee processes in order to provide that kind of community level input on whether the claims are established or not.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, turning to our next question. This one is back to Matt here. So you mentioned that increasing the minimum sample size or the period of performance could mitigate the harm due to low reliability, but might reduce validity or affect quality program participation. Can you discuss the balance between these factors and provide examples of how these trade-offs have been managed?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question. So, it comes back to, again, there's these trade-offs and making sure you're looking at this trade-off of reliability, validity, and even participation, right? So you should take into consideration that specific context and the impact of the measure. So the decision context, right? So are there thresholds? Are there low volume cutoffs to consider? So if you increase the sample size, you may improve reliability, but you also may reduce participation. So to really help to inform some of these decisions, we recommend really engaging with those stakeholders, either the program implementers or even some of these entities that may be held accountable to the measure, to understand the potential impacts and adjusting things like sample size. Like what would a change in sample size mean for the impact of the measure? Is it negligible to the extent where you can change that required sample size for the measure, or would losing certain entities really result in a significant proportion of people that you're not seeing a lot of care performance in, and there's obviously a high impact as a result of that. So really working with these entities, really working with these stakeholders is really crucial, because it helps provide that knowledge or that decision making for you to optimize that balance. And in order to, again, to meet the goals of whatever the measure is trying to achieve, as well as if it's used in some sort of a quality program, the goals of the quality program as well. So it's a good question, and it really is going to take into consideration that connection with those stakeholders, but also then clearly making that argument and showing that type of outreach that you've done and communicating that in a very clear way to ultimately get to your decision on this is why the sample size was increased, or whatever else it was that you're trading off to improve reliability.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I see some great questions still, but unfortunately we have about a minute left. We will, though, if your question wasn't answered today, we will follow up with those questions and give some answers there. So they aren't lost here. We'll have some follow up for some additional conversation, and we'll post that material to the hub. So before we close off our presentation today, I have a quick announcement. So if you could go to the next slide, I just want to share with everyone on the call today that we have a trio of animated videos available illustrating the purpose and key functions of some MMS tools. So these are only like 6 to 8 minutes long, so they're short and sweet, really helpful. We have one on the MMS Hub, one on CMIT, and then another on Merit. So please check those out. We'll link those in the chat. Yeah, hopefully those will be interesting for you all. And with that, thank you so much to our presenters today and for everyone who attended. Have a good rest of your afternoon.